I think in the 21st century, we've seen massive changes in the way in which war is fought and waged, especially in the years since September 11th, and the way in which the United States and its allies has changed the type of weaponry that it uses. And a lot of the research that I've done in the area focuses on drones specifically, and looks at the kind of proliferation of drone warfare in the conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq. And one of the big things that we've seen in this area is this relationship between distance, relationality, and experience. And drones have massively changed how humans interact with each other on the battlefield. And the battlefield, in fact, has become digital. And we see these incredible distances between the people who are fighting wars and the people who are being targeted, who are being surveilled, and indeed victims of what is still a violent practice. Absolutely. I mean, if we take it from the perspective of Afghanis, Pakistanis, Iraqis who are on the ground and who are subject to 24-hour surveillance, we've seen research into this where those individuals have actually suffered massive trauma from being surveilled, from the sound and the sight of a drone constantly throughout your entire life, your daily existence, when you go to the market, when you go to school or to work. This is a practice that is deeply impactful on the day-to-day lives of civilians. And these are civilians, some of whom are being targeted by counterterrorism practices, but many of whom are not. And so there's a deep impact there. But the impact also exists on those who are doing the war fighting itself, right? If we think about drone pilots, for example, there's been some research done into questions of the impacts of drone warfare on pilots when we think about things like post-traumatic stress disorder. And the type of war that is waged, this technology really has changed the way that soldiers and military professionals interact with their subjects, their civilians, their targets. And when we think about things like post-traumatic stress, for example, we can think about, well, we no longer have a base camp that soldiers go back to. In fact, drone pilots often, at the end of their shift, they go home. They go home to their daily lives, to their families, to their children. And what impact does that have on how we live our lives? No, I think that there's so many areas where the increasing technological aspect of war is continuing to change and shift how we perceive political violence in general. And one of those areas outside of just looking at drones, which are continuing to proliferate, continuing to become, a very dominant weapon of war, is in thinking about robotic warfare. And that's something that is increasingly being looked at. And from an ethical perspective, we can think quite problematically, I think, about the impacts of post-human warfare and what it means to program warfare, to program particular decisions, particular engagements on a battlefield that don't involve humans at all, right? Because drone pilots are still making decisions. They're taking, instructions and commands, but they, in fact, are still making those decisions when looking at a screen. Post-human warfare, robotic warfare, offers us a whole other kind of entry point into the discussion of technology itself, and that's something that is increasingly being looked at, both in international relations, but also in considerations of kind of ethics. I think one of the most interesting things about the ethical side of thinking about technology and war is understanding questions of relationality and experience, and that's where I think kind of a feminist analysis that I do in my own work is useful, because when we think about the relational, when we think about how we as humans relate to each other using technology, that is deeply impacted by something like the use of a drone. The distance that is mediated through a screen, right? And we've heard drone operators describe that experience as it's like playing a video game. It's like playing a video game on the same level for years at a time, right? Because of the kind of rote practice of it and the repetitive nature of, well, you're surveilling people, you're looking at dots on a screen, but those dots are women, children, families, many different kind of circumstances on the ground that are then mediated through a particular experience or a particular screen. So that distance, I think, is something that we need to understand the relational, and we need to understand how individuals relate to each other, whether that's soldiers relating to each other as comrades on a battlefield, or civilians and targets, and soldiers, drone operators relating to each other. Those relationships, I think, are vital to understanding the ethical element of how we are impacted by drone warfare.